So, got a comment on YouTube about time from a gentleman who says he works 70 hours a week. I don't know anything about the guy except he makes comments from time to time, so thanks for being here. But as I pondered on that, I got some information called up to mind, and I want to share that. And so we're going to touch on several things in this video. We're going to touch on the idea of big things versus little things and the meaning to God. We'll touch on the widow's mite, and we will hit on some very important things that we're just going to touch on briefly about the importance of each day, each moment in each day. And so at the outset, I just want to say that I've got a server running, and usually I turn it off for these videos, but I am kind of in a hurry this morning in terms of being anxious to get on with my writing for the day. So let me know if it's bothersome, and if it matters, I'll turn it off in the future. So from Mark 12, we read, and this is the Lord speaking. He said unto them in his doctrine, beware of the scribes, which love to go in long clothing and love salutations in the marketplaces. It's not super obvious with that long clothing, but that's a reference to the edge of the garments that they wore, because that border had special significance, and then there was a blue portion of it, and it has doctrinal significance. So they started to make that part longer. And Isaiah spoke about how the Lord's train filled the temple. That wasn't like Thomas the Tank Engine train. It was train like a bridal train, the flowing robes. It's very significant. We'll talk about that some other time. Anyway, these guys made it longer to try to seem more important. In the chief seats in the synagogues and the uppermost rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses and for pretense make long prayers, these shall receive greater damnation. So this was sort of a direct jab to the face on the Pharisees, because they were focusing on all the wrong parts of the gospel. They were doing what they were doing with the motive of seeming more important than they were. And that's not good. The point of the gospel, as Jesus said, you become great as your willingness and ability to serve increases. You become great by becoming the least. And Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. So, as I was reading this gentleman's comment, so what was it about? It was a reflection on the video I made about a lot of things, including the Sabbath. And I said the Sabbath is a reflection of how you would use your time if the Lord freed you from toil. And this person said, well, I work 70 hours a week, and I can't even imagine what that would be like, paraphrasing. And I thought of all these ideas related to productivity that I might share that I think are insanely valuable. So my hypothesis, to be upfront about it, is that I'm sorry, I'm not sure why my voice isn't in very good shape this morning. I certainly have the hypothesis that I am aware of things that would make it so that this guy could get more done in less time. And that's even acknowledging I know nothing about him and what he does. He mentioned he has a school, or he works at a school. I know a thing or two about that. But transcending the specifics, it doesn't matter. The Lord has taught me many things about productivity. And when I say the Lord has taught me, I'm prompted to tell you explicitly that when I say that, don't presume people mean a certain thing when they say a certain thing. Open your mind to alternatives to more expansive ways of thinking. The Lord is in control of our understanding. Everything that's true or beautiful or useful or good or grows or makes you stronger, makes you better, increases your love, increases your joy, all of that comes from and is fulfilled in the Lord Jesus Christ. He is so good and so great that he doesn't force us to recognize his I was going to say imprint. That's not a strong enough way of saying it. That all of these things are absolutely from him and absolutely lead towards him and absolutely are only fulfilled in him. So he's not some company that stamps his brand on every single thing in a way that's in your face and is like the most prominent part of what you experience. But it all does come from him. And so when I say the Lord taught me this, or the Lord teaches me this, it's just acknowledging the fact that everything comes from him. That doesn't mean that it happened in some theophany or whatever, right? So if a kid gets too close to a wood stove and burns him or herself, that's a lesson that came from the Lord, because he made the laws that govern how that wood stove works. He gave the understanding to the person that invented the wood stove. He gave the muscular force to the person that chopped the wood. And he made the metal that the stove's made out of, right? So everything comes from him. And so acknowledging that is the safest way to just sort of blur this all together. Anyway, so back to the point here. So as I thought about all this, and I thought about, it's like The Matrix, to reference a movie that some of you are too holy to watch. When Neo says, I need guns, and the shelves of guns just roll into the thing, like blurred out because there's so many of them, and then he finds himself in the middle of this huge library of guns, this repository of guns. That's what happened with the productivity notes. So I thought, with more of my mind than God's mind, I thought, well, what can I choose from this to help here? And then the Lord squashed all that, and he said, no, teach about the widow's mite. And I was like, huh? And then he showed me all this. So this is what we're going to do. It'll be applicable to many people, though, not just folks who work 70 hours a week. There are larger principles here. So in order to tease this apart a little bit, we need to understand just a bit about the culture and the time. And in that time, a denarius was a day's wage. It was a coin that conveniently was the wage of a laborer. So the most common worker selling their time for money, doing manual work, that's what they would get for working an entire day. This is important in scriptures to understand, in scriptures like in Revelation, when it talks about the black seal that's opened and hyperinflation occurs, and it takes a day's wage to buy bread for a day. And if you do the math, that means there's nothing left over. You just have barely what you need to literally survive. No luxury, no surplus, no roof over your head, just bread. So, and not the good kind either. It's barley. Day's wages for a loaf of barley. So that's not great. And then a mite. What's a mite? A mite is 1/64th of a denarius. So that's a very small quantity of money. The widow had 2 of these. So doing just a little math, 2 mites is 1/32nd of a day's wages. So that's all well and good, and people have talked about this ad nauseum. So what am I going to add to the picture? Well, maybe nothing, but let's give it a shot. Let's talk about time. If you sleep 8 hours, that leaves you with 16 hours a day. So if you divide that by 32, you get 30 minutes, unless I made a math mistake, which is totally possible. So 30 minutes. Now 30 minutes is a funny quantity of time in my mind, because on the one hand, it's really not a lot of time. But when I think of 2 mites in the way we've described it here, it's value, because it's not a it's a quantity, but you understand it qualitatively in terms of the measure of the slice of a day's labor that it is. It's 1/64th. That is not a lot. You could go through the workday if you had to dig a hole with a post hole digger, like my 2 oldest sons have to for the project they're working on. One of my sons went out and he spent probably 30 seconds doing this, and then he came inside and he's like, "That's a terrible tool. I hate this. It gets out the tiniest bit of dirt." And I said, "You know nothing about that yet, my friend. You have a lot more to do before you really know the pain of a post hole digger." I have an old one that I got from somebody, very much used, but if all the holes I ever dug with a post hole digger were dug with that tool, it would sort of match the wear on it. So what I'm saying is I've put in my post hole time for sure. But it is a brutal job, especially in rocky soil. But notwithstanding the horror of post hole digging, 1/64th, if you chopped up the whole workday into 64 chunks, you could kind of count out the passage of time with this. Now we're doing this with 16 hours. 8 hours is half of that. And that's, 15 minutes. You could, if you had a chime that sounded every 15 minutes, you could punctuate the day that way. And that wouldn't be a ridiculous breadth of time to go through between chimes. So, in fact, I had, the person who was the president of my mission, he was some kind of corporate accountant, but he billed every 15 minutes. And I remember hearing about that because he used it for some sort of teaching at some point. And actually, I think it was related to making the most of your time and thinking in smaller denominations of time. And he billed every 15 minutes, and that got me thinking. To that point in my life, I had many jobs, but I never thought about time in such short quantities. And it made me realize that I was wasting a whole lot of time when I didn't think I was wasting any. Anyway, so when we talk about the widow's mites in terms of time, 2 mites is in this equivalence 30 minutes. And what I want to say here is that on the one hand, 30 minutes seems like a little bit of time, and on the other hand, it seems like a lot of time. When I think about 2 mites monetarily, it seems like a lot less money than I think 30 minutes is on time, because you can do a lot in 30 minutes. So when I'm doing my morning thing and I do look at the clock, because I'll lose track of time, if I have 30 minutes left, I can still do some serious damage on these books, and that's a good thing. But again, I mentioned I've had a lot of jobs, and it doesn't matter being a janitor, a roofer, working in an insurance company, whatever the case might be. As a professor, you can do a lot in 30 minutes. Heck, most classes are 50 minutes as a professor, so 30 minutes is a lot of time. Notwithstanding, I apologize. I don't know why I'm congested. Notwithstanding, 30 minutes is also a lot of time to carve out, right? It swings both ways. So now I'm going to flip this around a little bit. I'm making the point here because Jesus obviously cared about the 2 mites of this widow. Why? Because it was all she had to give. Now the rich people that have nothing to do all day, or who have very little to do all day, and if you have a lot to do all day, you realize that the people who have very little to do all day don't necessarily feel that way. But it's true still. They think that they have all these things to do, but they don't. My mom is disabled, and she worked several jobs, up to 3, but on average 2, her whole working life, until she had some serious health problems and had to stop all that. I shouldn't say had to stop, could no longer continue all that. And I've had this conversation with her many times. I was like, you have health problems, but man, what a blessing. You basically have nothing to do at this point. From this point on in your life, you have massive quantities of time to do almost anything. And she's like, yeah, health problems though. And I said, okay, we'll subtract that out of the list. You could read any book you want to all day long. You could write anything you want to all day long. You could learn anything you want to all day long. And that's just the tiny part that's just you, not what could you do for other people in that time. I mean, my goodness. And I've told her this many times, but I'm not sure she believed me until the last time we had this conversation, where I said, I would trade you all those health problems, doesn't matter. I would trade you in a quarter of a second for my life if I didn't have other people to take care of. I would trade you in a split second. And it sort of dawned on her, maybe a little, that I was serious. Anywho, so the 2 mites were valuable because it was all she had, right? So God cares about 30 minutes. People think that God doesn't care what you do when it's not Sunday. People think God doesn't care how you decide on certain decisions, just the ones that are overtly religious or somehow touch things that you overtly were told by some overtly religious leader. No, throw all that in the trash. Every second of every day, he cares what you're doing. To be in his path means to be thinking about what he would have you do 24/7. 24/7. There's not a moment when it doesn't apply. Now, acknowledging the fact that hardly anyone knows God well enough to fill in all that time, meaning they don't know what kind of breakfast cereal he would have you eat this morning, or if he'd have you eat breakfast cereal at all, because they just don't know him well enough to know what he would do in that situation. Fair enough, and that exposes a wonderful way to spend your time. Finding that out, ask the question. It might take 10 years, but you'll figure it out. Unless you meet someone who's more like him than you, and then they can just tell you. But the 30 minutes, it matters. Okay, so now what about all the people who say, but I don't have 30 minutes? Well, guess what? That 30 minutes, those 2 mites were 2 coins. They're 2 physical coins. And so even if they weren't together, they existed just as 2 separate objects. Your 30 minutes doesn't have to exist contiguously, meaning touching each other, meaning one block. It doesn't have to exist as one solid chunk of time. There are a lot of people who don't have 30 minutes in a solid block. I don't know anybody that doesn't have 30 minutes distributed over a day, but even if that person does not have 30 minutes distributed over a day, they've got it distributed over a week. So this person said, well, I don't know what I would do with a whole day in the week. That's a problem for several reasons. One, it sounds an awful lot like our former Speaker of the House who said you have to pass the bill to know what's in it, which is obviously absurd. If you don't know what you would do with a Sabbath day, there's no point in God giving you one. There are many reasons for this, but just to try to touch on it briefly, there are only 2 ways that I've figured out that you can understand the value of something. One is by God showing you through your understanding and revelation and thought and all that fun stuff before it happens. That's the best way, but it's also, in a way, it's the hardest way because you have to have the faith for him to explain it to you. That's a process. It takes understanding. But also, it causes a great deal of pain for you to comprehend, or at least begin to comprehend, the value of something while you still don't have it. Now, this doesn't stop people. If you think about, the fan just kicked off, so that means that Starlink isn't working at the moment. It'll turn back on. So if you notice a difference, let me know. So the value of something you do not have is painful because you have this desire that's unfulfilled. And your desire increases as God explains how good this thing is actually going to be. And then, and it's not necessarily a thing. It could be a situation or a person. And then, an experience. But this doesn't stop people. If you think about any kind of faithful person, using my definition of the word, and through faith, again, by Robert Smith, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on upwardthought.blogspot.com for free, the PDF. You can watch or listen to the audio here on YouTube for free. But if you think of a faithful person, one who envisions what could be and all the options, and then finds out how to get what they want, and then does, those people all experience this, could you call it a preemptive loss, where you are envisioning what could be and what is desired but not yet attained, and you carry the weight, the burden of the unfulfilled desire. So it happens all the time. It's totally doable. But the greater the blessing, the more that hurts. It's a terrible thing to have to carry that. But if you don't care about it before it happens, and then it happens, will it give you as much joy as if you had figured that out beforehand? Probably not. So I would say that the kind of person that can develop an appreciation for something while experiencing it is maybe the rarest kind of person there is. Now, what's my evidence for that? I'll just use one point. Jesus, in Hebrews, Paul tells us that Jesus learned obedience by the things he suffered. It's not a good translation. A more effective phrasing of that idea would be something like, Jesus learned the value of always obeying the Father through the things he suffered. Because he didn't learn obedience in the sense that he was ever disobedient, but he did learn the value of being obedient. And how? Through the things that he suffered. So if suffering was required for the Son of God to learn the value of things, I think it's safe to say that you and I require it. So that suffering either happens in the way I previously described, where you look forward to obtaining something and you experience what it's like to not have it, or you get it, you don't appreciate it, because people don't, and then you lose it. And that is a way that you can learn the value of what you had and lost. Now, of course, the problem with that is that you've lost it, right? So, and most people don't go through an experience like that with retroactive joy. Like, yeah, I didn't know what I had when I had it, but now that I've lost it, I'm really grateful that I had it. You know, you might get comments like that from time to time from a spouse who's died, and the survivor says, well, I really didn't know what I had until he or she was gone, and thank God that we had that time together. But most of the time, it's just bitterness. So, and the reason for that is that most of the time it's not recoverable. You can't just go out and get another one of whatever it is that you had that you didn't realize you had. So you live in relative prosperity, all of you. On a historical basis, you're richer than kings and queens of the past. But do you feel that kind of joy? I have a friend who lived in a teepee for 7 years. And he says every single night that he gets into bed, he feels over the moon happy that he's not sleeping on the ground again. And I haven't done that, lived in a teepee, but I have slept on the ground a lot, particularly in the Army. And it's something I never enjoyed. And I do every single night. When I get into bed, I am just so happy. I'm also exhausted, so whatever. But the point is, there are things that you are massively that we take for granted, valuable. I I'm super grateful for plumbing. I love toilets. I love toilets, and it's weird. Again, this is the first kind of value that I was talking about. I look ahead and I know what's coming. I know a great deal of what's coming. And because of my faith, I have experienced a great deal of what's coming. And so I appreciate things a lot. When I get my favorite kind of peanut butter is Skippy, and it's weird. I there are a few things like this where there's nothing fancy about Skippy peanut butter, but if it's not Skippy, I'd rather not eat it. And that's not to say that I'm some kind of peanut butter snob. I just enjoy Skippy that much that nothing else can compare. And that's a nice safe example to use of that concept. But every time, I don't have peanut butter too often. But we always have it because we have a lot of kids, and that's a commodity food. As you get older, you can't eat so much peanut butter and bread, but it's great for the kids. So anyway, anytime I open a jar of peanut butter and I just have a little spoon of peanut butter, that's a real treat. I just am over the moon and grateful for Skippy peanut butter, right? Because I know there's going to be a time when we don't have that. And I have relative value versus the other peanut butter. Anyway, it's really important to value things. And there are only two ways that you can gain the value, really. One is you suffer before you get it. The other is you suffer after you get it. And if you had the choice, most people would say, I'd rather suffer before I get it. But they don't live that way. They say that because rationally they realize, man, if you lose out on it and you never get it again, that really stinks. The other way is hard. In a lot of ways it's harder, but you get to keep it. That's the thing, is you don't have to lose it as part of the gaining the value. But they don't actually live that way. So in this case, is a perfect example. You say, well, I don't have time for a Sabbath, so I don't even know what that would be like. Maybe you don't have time for a Sabbath because you don't know what it's like. And I contend that that's actually truer. Because if you knew what it was like, you would absolutely make the time. Even if you couldn't do it in one solid block, you'd move towards that. It's probably obvious that this is where we're going, by more effectively blocking out smaller chunks of time throughout the week. Maybe only 10 minutes, maybe only 5 minutes. At various times in my life, I've lived in poverty. And one of these times, of course, relative poverty, but relative to the standard of living in the United States, certainly below the line. One of these times, I was visiting with an older gentleman, and it was interesting because I was visiting, well, it was on a Sunday. This is how, when I didn't live in the middle of nowhere, I'd spend my Sundays this way, visiting people that were lonely, amongst other things. But it was a normal staple. And so I was visiting with this guy who didn't have many visitors, and I thought I was doing good for him. And as is frequently the case, I probably got more out of it. That not in a bad way. I did give what I intended to give to him, but he gave me more. We were talking about something, and as you know, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that I am a person with no guile. Maybe I am, but I am a person who speaks what they really think and what they really feel. And anyone who knows me to any extent knows that very quickly. Usually much to their dismay. So with him, I was myself, as I always am, and I said something about how I was lamenting. I've always had a lot of desire for service in my heart, And I was lamenting that things were so tight financially that I didn't have more to give to others because I really wanted to. And without a hesitation of any type, he turned to me and he said, well, you can always give $1. And this was shocking to me because this guy was really poor. And he had been pretty much his whole life. And he was old now. And I said, it cut me to the core because I didn't realize that I wasn't doing the best that I could in that regard, that I had more to give that I didn't know about. So I was very grateful, and I instantly changed. And I've never forgotten that idea that you can always give $1. So you might say you have no time. Do you have 5 minutes? And now let me give you an example of this. So I was in the National Guard for a decade, and if you totaled up all the time that I was on orders, it was over 2 years. So across those years, there were many times when, and it wasn't like office time, it was usually like pretty intense training time where we were out doing stuff. So not a whole lot of normal life in those 2 years, 2 or 3 years. So lots of intense things to do and not much sitting around. And at some point, I realized that there had to be a way for me to find time to study the scriptures and pray. Because, when you're in a barracks or you're sleeping on the ground or whatever, it's like it's really hard to get alone. I was in a lot of situations where I was always around tons of people, and there's a lot of noise and a lot of carrying on and things to worry about. It was in intense situations. And then I realized that in most of the places we were in, there were these porta pots, these portable toilets. And it was really hot outside, and it was really smelly in the portable toilet. But we had cargo pockets, and I had a little tiny version of scriptures. And so I started carrying them in a cargo pocket. And that was a tradition I picked up and I kept with. And I would go into the toilet, and I would stay in there for as much time as was reasonable. And that would be my little devotion time. And it made all the difference in the world. That was literally all the time I had to give. The rest of the time I was expected to be doing things. And I needed to be doing things to not let people down. So that's the way it went. And so if you apply that toilet time principle, I bet that you have time during the week that you're not actually using to the full extent. Maybe that time is literally, man, I'm sorry. Maybe that time is literally toilet time. So if you sum up all the time that you're sitting on the toilet every week, if you're just scrolling through your phone, maybe that's not the best use of your time. And you'd be shocked to find how much you can get out of reading the scriptures during that time, if that's the best use of your time. You can pray while you're on the toilet. I think that would probably offend a lot of people, but you need to realize that, one, Jesus was a man and he had to poop too. Two, and that didn't make him any less holy, right? Two, Adam and Eve were naked in the Garden of Eden, and we are all naked before God. Clothes don't hide who you are. He knows you poop. It's not offensive to him. Now, is that going to be like a Holy of Holies experience? Well, it could be. It could be if God wants to make it one. But the idea is like that should not be the pinnacle of your spiritual life, your toilet time. But the principle here is, if you truly are so burdened by the toil of life that you don't have. Now, you're going to look and see the comment and see who made it. I'm not saying this is the case of this person. I already told you I don't know anything about him or her. It might be her. But I'm saying if you can't find the time to achieve the relationship with God that you're searching for because you're so burdened with the toils of life, it doesn't go from where you are to jumping to having a 16-hour day extra over what you've got. That's not the way anything works in the gospel or the world. Even in the temporal world, no one does that. No one says, man, I don't know what minimum wage is now, but I'm making $8 an hour flipping burgers, and man, if I was just making $2 million a year, wouldn't that be great? But, well, I guess there's no path from A to B, and I just have to flip burgers until $2 million drops out of the sky. Well, it's not going to happen, right? So the question is, from where you stand right now, what's a step in that direction? Just one step. Just one step in that direction that you could do right now, even today. And maybe that step is, I'm going to spend 5 minutes while I'm sitting on the toilet reading the Bureau of Labor Statistics website to see what other jobs are out there and what it takes to get them. Just 5 minutes on the toilet. That's a step towards that end, right? And it might change your whole life. Because the path we're getting there, to a greater explanation of this point, the path to any end goes through today. Anything in your future goes through today. No matter how big something is, it's going to go through this moment. So every path comes to now, or every path leads from now. We are horrifically bad at looking at the big things and the little things in the way they should be seen. Alma 37:6 says, now ye may suppose that this is foolishness in me, but behold, I say unto you, that by small and simple things are great things brought to pass. And small means in many instances doth confound the wise. What he's saying in plain English is, the biggest of things come through the littlest of things. Don't look over little things, because they make all the big things happen. This is true in every scope. If I look back on my short life, and I were to make like a bubble chart, do you know what those are? A bubble chart, of how important things were. So the size of the circle is the importance of the thing. If you read the label of what it would shock you. Like what made all the difference? It's always the least likely thing that starts in the smallest, meaningless way. And that's one reason why you need to understand every moment matters. Because it's a fallacy to believe that things of great value will seem to have great value to you right now. Because they won't. It's just like if you go to Walmart and you look at the great value cans, they're plain white, they look cheap. They're designed to look inexpensive so that you buy them thinking you're saving money, whatever the price is. But it's funny because the label says great value. God sends you all kinds of things in life that the label literally says great value, but the can looks cheap, right? So you got to pay attention to all the little things and adopt behaviors that don't rely on the obviousness of the value of the thing. It's super important. And I am going to write literally volumes about this, but they're not ready yet. So here's some real world examples of small things making enormous differences. Hormones. You're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny little quantity of stuff. It makes all the difference in the world in how your body operates, how you feel, and what you get done. It's a tiny thing with an enormous impact. Slightly related, but this is the field that I work in. Effective dose of drugs. You're talking tiny, tiny, tiny little quantities. The effective dose is actually there's another phrase, and now I'm embarrassing myself because I can't remember. Anyway, the minimal amount of drug where it starts making a difference in your body. It might be effective dose, but it might be another phrase. I can't remember. Those are tiny, tiny little quantities. It matters to what I do because we make software to help them see these things in samples that they analyze. And it's a safety concern where it's complicated, but the human body is complicated. And if you put a tiny, tiny, tiny little amount of a drug in someone, it's not going to hurt them, but you can measure, if your equipment and your analysis is good enough, you can measure when it starts making a difference. And if you start there, you can test in a way where you graduate that and you don't hurt someone. So that's nice. Anyway, minimal effective dose. So fentanyl right now is a huge problem because it's got such a low effective dose. Tiny quantities can actually kill someone. And so it's a big deal, even though it's little. So there are many things in life that have an effective dose in tiny increments. And this is why the more someone gets to know God, the more extreme they seem on certain things that no one else cares about, right? Jesus made a whip, and he started whipping people, doing what whole crowds of people thought was okay. Whole crowds of people thought that the exchanges of money and animals in the temple courtyard was okay. The way that was going down was okay. And all the people just thought he was nuts for doing this, right? But you have to ask yourself why the priests didn't intervene and stop him. Because they didn't. They all stood there and let him do it. They didn't want him to do it, but they didn't stop him, and you should ask why. I have, and the answer is because they knew that what those people were doing was wrong. But they didn't have the fortitude to do anything about it. They were also making money off of the situation. But they knew it was wrong, so they didn't stop him. But the crowds of people thought he was nuts. Why? Because they didn't understand that it was wrong. The priests, whose job it was to tell the people that it was wrong, literally that was their job, were not doing their job. And so the people didn't know it was wrong. So in you've got the crowds, which is the natural man. You've got the priest, which is your spirit. And then you've got Jesus, the Holy Ghost, right? Jesus is not the Holy Ghost, but I'm saying these are the roles played by all going on inside of your body. And so you have to yield to the influence of God within you because you don't know the effective dose. You're the natural man, and your priest isn't doing his job. So, to sum all of this up, everything you do matters. And this is a point I didn't make separately. I'll just make that now. Everything you need to go on in progress with God, you have every day. Every day, he has precisely arranged every day, as long as you're keeping all of his commandments, as far as you understand them, he has arranged in each day precisely what you need to draw as near to him as you can in a day. This is an enormous promise. As you do everything you imagine he would do in your place, and as you don't do everything you imagine he would not do in your place, according to your sincere belief right now, you have the promise that all you need to make all the progress that can be made today is in today. And so it's important not to see each day's toil as separate from your spiritual journey. They are as combined as your body and your spirit. There's no such thing as temporal and spiritual with God. They're all one. So as you're billing your 15-minute increments as a hotshot executive accountant, you need to be thinking, how can I be a hotshot executive accountant like Jesus would be in my place? Because he's using that time to shape you, like chiseling stone. He's shaping you in every situation. He designed creation specifically for that purpose. And your work that you do in the office is a chisel. The work that you do as a plumber when you're knee deep in sewage, that hardly happens as a plumber, but that's the chisel. You're a mom, you have 5 kids, they're driving you nuts. That's the chisel, right? Or you're a mom and you're cleaning the counter for the 5 billionth time. That's the chisel. How would Jesus clean that counter? How would Jesus plunge that toilet? And what you're going to find is the toilet plunging, the counter wiping, the whatever isn't the point. The spirit you do it in is. And that spirit you do it in will come out when you're wiping that counter and your cute little kid comes up to you and says, I don't know, Mom, can you read me a story? Or Mom. And how you react to that, that's the chisel for the day. That's the effective dose. That, Bob works for me and he's killing himself. He's been such a loyal, dedicated employee, and I would probably give him a raise right now, but I know I don't have to, because I know he's going to keep working for me even if I don't. That's the chisel. What do? What would Jesus do? He would do what's just. Give the dude a raise. Inversely, Bob's really slacking. He's been slacking for a long time. I've talked to him like 20 times because I hate firing people, but he is not doing his job. And I've exercised all the mercy I can because at this point I'm endangering the well-being of all the people who are doing their job by keeping Bob. What do? What would Jesus do? He would fire Bob. Right? So that's the chisel. So, in summary, approach every aspect of your daily toil as a spiritual experience, and you will gain more blessings as if you had explicit spiritual time. Step 1. Well, these aren't chronological or sequential, but these are just separate ideas. That's idea 1. Idea 2. You might not have 16 hours in contiguous time in a week to have a Sabbath. I won't get into the argument of if that's true or not. Doesn't matter to the point, which is, how much time do you have distributed throughout the week? And are you making the greatest use of it? Even in unexpected, atypical situations like toilet time. That's idea 2. And idea 3, be super careful about the little things because they make all the difference. Think about effective dose and be very particular at all times and in all places about thinking about what the Lord would do in your place. Because sometimes that whole day was constructed for one interaction or one moment when you're by yourself. And you need to catch those things. Paul says, the language of it is weird, so I'm paraphrasing. I'm going to butcher this, but he said something about entertaining angels unawares. So be mindful of strangers because many people entertain angels unawares. Something like that. It's a terrible phrasing. But on face value, what he's saying is be real careful about all of your interactions with people because when you come across an angel of the Lord, it won't always be super obvious. Now, this has fulfillment in real ways because angels do come in disguise. They do, as humans. They come in disguise. And these are beings from heaven in disguise. But God has mortal angels. And I'll talk about this a lot more later. And it's actually way better if you come across one of those versus the ones that drop out of heaven, right? The visit from heaven. It's way better to come across a mortal angel. And Paul was actually, in that verse, he was giving us keys to identify when that's happening. But the nugget out of that that's relevant to this conversation is it's because of the value they bring. That's what indicates whether you've got one on your hands or not. And I could talk a lot more about that, but just keeping it to what is relevant for this, every moment of every day, it's not just about interactions with people, though that tends to be super important for various reasons, because we're made in the image of God. It's a canvas that he can paint any image on, whereas rocks or janitor work or whatever the case may be, those are all limited. The human canvas is unlimited, except by our choices. So there exist people he can do anything with that he needs to do, which is an amazing thought. And you can be one of them if you just love him. He can use you to that extent. So anyway, every moment though, speaking of time and situations, every moment of every day could be the tool God's trying to use to reach you. And you have to learn, if not to be in gear all the time, you have to learn how to be instant in season, out of season. That's another scriptural quote. Instant in season, out of season. You have to be ready to switch over at any moment. There's an analogy coming to mind. There are tools that instantly switch. So for example, I have a welding mask, and when I'm not welding, I can see through it just fine. But the second the sparks fly, it goes super dark, right? And it's not instant, but it's fast enough that I don't notice the sparks, right? Which is great because I don't get blinded. But our eyelashes are super sensitive too. So just recently I was plugging in a tractor hose. Oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna get into how frustrating that is. But seasonally, those things, they become from time to time, and it's just this one in particular on my tractor. It's like super high pressure. It's ridiculous. And so I went to relieve the pressure with some MacGyver-like tricks. And most people that watch this channel are at least as old as me, so they'll get what I'm talking about. So I did the MacGyver trick, which was not my idea. It was a brilliant idea by someone else. And oil just sprayed everywhere. And it's funny because I turned to my friend who had the idea. And I was like, be careful, this is pressurized. Watch your eyes. And then it sprayed all over my face. I had my hand over it. I really thought that would be okay. But there's a joke with, it's usually a guy joke, but safety squints. Most men know what that means, and that's when you squint for safety, because this is like in lieu of going and getting safety goggles. But your eyes react very quickly, and so actually, like, I didn't notice the spray. I noticed my eyes closing, and then the spray hit. Right? It's like psychic eyes. So there are things that react like that, and you have to be instant out of season when God's situations hit you, which, here's the hint, they're all his situations. But you don't know the importance when it happens, typically, in the moment. So when it hits you, you have to have this sensibility that you switch over like, okay, this is a test, right? And there's only so much you can encounter in life with that mentality of this is a test, therefore I will care. You have to care all the time. That's what I'm trying to tell you, is you don't know when it's a test. So the hack to being instant in season, out of season is don't be out of season ever, right? That's overwhelming for people. But remember, his burden is light. His yoke is easy and his burden is light, because his way, it might seem harder, but that's only because we're stupid. If we saw more, If we understood more of what he understood, we'd get that his way is the easiest possible way given reality. It's the best thing. There's nothing better. And you really have to believe that for reals. There's no faking it, right? If you don't really believe that, then you're just going to spend your toilet time doing what people do on the toilet. But it might make all the difference in the world. The scripture you find during that brief interlude might change your whole life. And he'll give it to you. He'll draw it to your attention and teach you what he will teach you because you're making the sacrifice. All things come through faith. You can't get around it. So if you don't have riches to give, whether that be money or time or ability, it doesn't matter. He doesn't actually care about the quantity. He cares about the quality. And what I mean by that is he cares about the fraction of what you have to give. And here's the it's not a clue, but here's the answer. We can solve the puzzle, Pat. It's 100% is what he needs. Not 99, not 15, not Sundays only, 100. 100%. So go and find out what kind of accountant Jesus would be, what kind of school dude. And one other thing I was supposed to say, which I forgot, was here's how here's a very, very practical example. I'm going to tell you how Jesus would grade exams, which that probably sounds as ridiculous as it gets, okay? But this is legit, I'm telling you, okay? And there might be a better way. There might be a more close approximation to explaining how Jesus would grade exams, and I'm all ears if there is. But I'm telling you, this is going to be eternities ahead of where most teachers would be. Okay? I'm going to lay it out for you, and it's important because you have to understand this principle. The principle being, what would Jesus do in my place is not Sunday school stuff. It's practical. How would Jesus relieve the pressure on that tractor? Not the way I did it the other day. But now I know, and knowing is half the battle. So, how would Jesus grade papers? I'm going to tell you how I did in like 40 minutes what would take my colleagues about 10 hours. Not joking, maybe 40 hours. And this is the level of productivity. When God says, I will prosper you in the land, it's no joke. To quote our wonderful president, it's no joke. When he says he will prosper you in the land, this is a huge mystery. I don't want to get into it all right now. But a big chunk of this is he will show you better ways of getting the same amount of impact in less time. That's not the bulk of what that promise means or what it entails, but it's a serious chunk. Okay? And one of the blessings of prosperity is that in the Lord we can find the real rules of cause and effect, and we can gain the understanding through the quickening of the Spirit in our minds. We can gain the understanding of how things actually work in order to do them more effectively. And we can break free from the corruption in our desires, in our heart, so that we can actually focus on why something matters and not be doing it for actually like shadow reasons in the dark that are more about wanting to feel good about ourselves than actually doing good, particularly for others, okay? I've just given you some really important things that you've probably never thought about. And you may never have thought about if I hadn't said it. So, let's dig into a very practical example. These are things that are laid out on hundreds and hundreds of pages in these books. And I'm just giving you a super condensed version to chew on for those with ears and eyes. And brains. So, computer science exams, as I was a computer science professor for about 8 years, Computer science exams are notoriously terrible to take, and they're even worse to grade. They're really hard because what they tend to entail are programming questions where you have to write it out by hand. The problem with that is that they're always complicated. I mean, that's the whole point. You want to test someone, so you give them something hard. And the magnitude of possibilities of answers that people can give, it's insane. And then you need to know, as the grader, you need to know your craft well enough to know exactly how the computer would evaluate that code, even catching one character worth of a deviation from what it ought to be, knowing all possible ways of doing all possible things. It's insanely hard, okay? It's a nightmare. And so one technique with this is, instead of all that, you just ask them to bring laptops to class, and you give a live test. And you can have people sitting in the back or walking around watching screens to make sure people aren't using chat or something. So there is some level of trust because you can only police it so much. But that's one level of doing it that just bypasses all the difficulty. And then they either have the output or they don't, right? And that's much more realistic because they can actually write and run code, and they don't have to be these automaton robots that are able to produce perfect syntax in one go. But for a while, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of asking students to bring laptops, even though almost all of them had them. And all of them should have had them. But whatever. So with paper tests, the question is, how do you gain productivity? How do you save 40 hours? Well, and this is several times a semester, by the way. It's terrible. Another side note is, in any credible university, a class like that will have an army of TAs, and the TAs have to do all this work. So you give them a key, and they have to do the grading. And then the professor only has to deal with people that want to complain about grades, or I should say challenge, but I've already revealed my bias. They want to come in and challenge the grade. And so you have to have those conversations. And then if you find a problem with the way the TA was doing it, you have to call them in and fix that. But those are credible universities, not questionable ones. And in questionable universities, either the resources aren't given, or they're squandered by a department chair that has serious issues. And I'll leave it to your imagination to fill in the blanks on that. So, when you're doing a paper test and you don't have any TAs, you're going to burn 40 hours grading this thing. How can you do it more efficiently? Well, I'll tell you. Before you start, you ask, why are we doing this? What's the point? Okay? That's how you do it. Step one. The point in this is to see if they know what they're doing, right? Okay? Do you need to parse through every single word of their answer to figure that out? Absolutely not, okay? So here's the technique that I used. I graded each question one at a time. So if we're on page 3 of the exam, every single exam, my whole stack was on page 3. And the first step was to make 3 piles. The one pile was, this is essentially correct. The other pile was, this is essentially incorrect. The essentially corrects got full points. The essentially incorrect got 0 points. The middle pile was, I'm not sure. So just that step would always reduce the pile by at least 50%. Sometimes a lot more than that. So then you take that pile and you subdivide it into partial credit. And let's say the question's worth 10 points. So you split it into 2 piles, and one pile gets like let's say 2.5 points or 3 points, if we just, and then the other gets 8 points or something like that. And you split it between those, and in some cases, you'll end up with a third pile that's, I really have to actually look at these closely. Now, what's interesting about this is that most students will not actually come and complain about their grades. It's always a subset of the ones that actually question them. Most of those people will not come and question them to your face. They'll just leave you a nasty review, passive aggressively. But objectively, the number of students that came to complain once I employed that system was less than half that came before. And so this tells you something about the effectiveness of this grading, is the students were happier with it, right? But in objective terms, if you compare what the point was of grading these exams, it was at least as effective as the other way. There was no loss, and potentially there was gain in the effectiveness of doing the job. It's very interesting, right? I'll give you another example. It's extremely time consuming to make a key for an assignment, which is the right answer, right? And one of the challenges of that is there can be more than one right answer in a complex problem. And I went over a little bit of that. So to get around this, teachers usually use the same assignments semester after semester. The problem with that is that students will absolutely sell their assignments to future classes. Cheating is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem. And it's a terrible problem because the honest students are punished for not cheating. And it skews the averages, and ignorant teachers don't realize how extensive this is. And they don't want to face it because it would make them do more work and have more uncomfortable conversations and get more heat from their boss because they're failing people who are cheating. So it's interesting that student conduct codes are always nice on paper, but the administrations don't really want you to enforce them. It's just like when I was in the Army, I was a company commander. We had physical fitness tests all the time. And we were given mandates of compliance of how many people had to be to at or above the standard. But then if you actually enforce what the handbooks say, you would get in trouble because they didn't want to lose people, even if they were overweight and out of shape. They didn't want their numbers to go down because then they'd get in trouble for that. Anyway, so it's all sort of a joke and very dishonest. But sticking to the point here, to make a key, no one is going to change the assignment every time and make the key because they're not going to spend all that extra time. They'd rather just have people cheat and have their life be easier. Not the cheaters, the professors, the teachers. So instead of making a key, what I realized was reliably about 3% of the students would be absolutely brilliant. And you could always pick out who they were very early on from class interactions. And so, and even if you didn't know who they were, you knew who they were on the first exam because you could tell that they had all the right answers. So what I did was I just took all the exams from the brilliant students and made them the key. And so I never made a key after I figured that out. And so, and sometimes like you could pick out like maybe no one got this question right, and then it's your fault as a teacher and you don't grade it anyway and you give everyone the points for that one. So my point in going through all this detail on this was, one, you can see very quickly why I was something like 10 times more productive than all my peers at everything I've ever done. You have to think about what you're actually doing and what the point is. So then the question becomes, why didn't everyone do it that way? Well, if you asked them what the point was of what we were doing, they'd probably come up with the same answer that I did. I don't think that would be disputed. However, if you looked at the way they did their job and you asked them, why do you do it this way rather than that way? If I had told them this is how I did things, they would immediately go ballistic. Their minds would explode. They'd be very upset and angry, and they'd accuse me of things. Why? Of being lazy or doing this or whatever. You're not doing your job. You get paid to do this job. Blah, 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 blah. Right? And the reason they would say things like that is not because I did a less effective job. Because objectively, my performance in the ways we differed was better than theirs, not the same, and certainly not worse. Okay? And they weren't complaining that it was bad somehow that I had more time than them as a result, because I invested a great deal of that time making other things better, like constantly improving the quality of the class, right? Because I had time to do it, where they didn't. They didn't. They had to use the same stuff every year because they didn't have time to revise it. For me, every semester was like a new class. I'd keep the stuff that worked really well, but I'd always be improving the things that didn't. The reason they would complain would be because they couldn't do it that way, because it would violate the real reason they were doing what they were doing. It wasn't to teach the students. It was so that they could feel good about themselves. And I figured this out pretty early on. And I wondered why there were so many terrible computer science teachers. Because I'd watch people teach things a certain way, being in all the classes myself, coming up through the ranks. But then we'd sit in on other people's classes and things, and I'd say, why do they do it that way? That's like the hardest possible way to get someone to understand this idea. Or I'd suggest things that we could change in the curriculum, like the way math is taught in computer science is horrifically terrible. It's 100 times harder than it needs to be, and people struggle with math. And we weren't doing any exit interviews. I said, can we start doing exit interviews for people that leave the program, or either by graduating or by quitting? And when we did, prominently, like 85% of the time that people left is because, quote, the math was too hard. We're sending people over to the math department to learn math because we need it in computer science. And they're learning it from these, I'm trying to be nice here, but if you know any math professors, right, the nicest way I can say this is they're people who are naturally proficient at math and who think that that's the cat's pajamas. Right? Who seriously think that's the most interesting thing that anyone could ever do. And it naturally makes sense to them. They've never had to think about why, because they just memorize what other people tell them and it makes sense to them. They don't actually think about the sense part. They just do what they're told. And that's math, right? It's most modern math people. You don't have people coming up with these brilliant new theories because people who are good at math are actually just good at memorizing math that other people have figured out. Well, computer science isn't like that. You can't just regurgitate what you're told. You actually have to think about everything that you're doing because everything is new, right? Unless you're some Java programmer who's been doing the same thing for 20 years, every day is a new problem. And there are plenty of computer science jobs that are competitive or repetitive, but the teaching is not. It's new. You're barraged by new things all the time. You actually have to understand them. So lo and behold, we had people failing out of the math all the time. And then they'd leave the program. So I said, well, why don't we just integrate what's needed in the context of computer science directly? We happen to have a very math-oriented professor in our department who I thought was a tremendously great teacher. And he was all over the idea because he would love to teach math instead of computer science. And merge them all together because he was super good at both of them. And I shouldn't say instead of computer science, but those aspects of computer science. And there was tremendous resistance. And I figured out the reason why they gave all these excuses that had nothing to do with reality, and I knew they were lying. And I figured out the real reason was because they had all made it through that math. And it was a badge of their worthiness. It was a badge of their worth. And they liked when people failed out of the program because it made them feel better about themselves. And these are people who had nothing else going on in their lives of which they were proud. And so they needed this to be hard for the students. And it was super hypocritical because several of them were only good at it because they had put in the time to be good at it at the cost of everything else. And they couldn't pass their own exams if they were in their class at that level, if you get what I'm saying. And it was abundantly obvious. And that's hypocrisy. It's very bad. Anyway, so that was a deep dive into strict applications. But what I'm, applying it to your situation, if you find yourself working 70 hours a week, pause, take some time, even if it has to be on the toilet, and get a legal pad and write down, why am I doing what I'm doing? So first ask, what am I doing? And that list will be easy to make. And then next, flip the page and say, why am I doing this? Go down the list of the whats and write the why. Now throw away the whats and flip it around. Go down the whys and ask yourself prayerfully, what's the best possible way to achieve this outcome? You'll probably get a different list than the whats you started with. And then go with that. The challenges you are going to face are your own traditions, your own self-esteem. And that's why I went into all those examples. You'll see. Your own self-esteem, the traditions, and the criticisms of others. So don't tell them your whats. Right? So if you're in a job where someone's over your shoulder all the time, this is going to be something you have to address with your supervisor, and you can ask them, what's your why? Like, why are you paying me? And is that what you really want? Right? If you're the boss, this is a lot easier. Or if you have a job that's semi-autonomous, where you are graded, so to speak, on what you contribute, not how you get there. So, I'm not in sales, but a salesperson could tell you they know what they get paid to do. And salespeople, I think, tend to be really good at this figuring out what it's really all about and then doubling down on that. So I know a salesperson, let's see, actually, I just did a quick count. I know a surprising number of salespeople, and none of them punch the clock, so to speak. They know what they need to do to get their commissions, and they go and do that in the way it makes most sense. I talked to a guy, really awesome guy. I just loved this conversation, and it was facilitated by someone from this channel, so thank you. You know who you are. But I talked to this guy. We'll call him Slim, although that's not his name. So Slim is in his 60s, and he's had this illustrious career in business. And I said that I do this. I went into this conversation as a mentor call, and I had all these questions that I thought would be relevant. And then the conversation went elsewhere, and I was just soaking it all up. I took like 6 pages of notes in this call. And one of the things that Slim told me, he said, here's how you become an effective salesman. You find out when prime time is to make sales, which is, depending on the customer and what field you're in and everything. And then you spend all your other time developing yourself into a better salesperson. That's like the simplest advice in the world, but how many people actually do that? And so, like, if you're not a salesperson, cool. What are you? And do you do that? So how often are you sharpening the saw, to use Stephen Covey language? And have you ever thought about why you're actually doing what you're doing? So Okay, this video is long enough, and I've dumped on you tons and tons of ideas. I hope something here is helpful for somebody, but take care. I gotta roll.